There's also this thing, another one of these things about the nuclear family as being somehow kind of systemically racist because blacks have lower marriage rates and more single moms and so on. What's the text of that? What's the subtext of that?
Well, it's human beings are not historians. And it's funny, before Mad Men existed, like 20 years ago, I was thinking about trying to do it, but I'm not an artist. I thought a lot of people need a deep dive into what America was like on all levels, not in 1915, 1960. I really did, and that's where Mad Men ended up beginning. But I thought we need to see 1960 in full color, and not what was going on in Washington, D.C., but just ordinary people. And one of the things I wanted to show was that in 1960, black people had nuclear families at basically the same rate as white people. You think that because things for black people were so much worse in the past, which I don't think anybody could seriously deny, you assume that there is the same rate of single motherhood, the same rate of children being raised only by one parent. And you might think that it's because jobs were scarce and so black men couldn't stick around or something like that. Not true. If you went to the typical American city in, say, 1949, for one thing, any able-bodied black male over a certain age worked. There was no question about it. And the default was that people were married and had kids. What we see today is something that started accelerating in the 1960s, and by the 1970s in many communities became a norm. Now, that means if you want to talk about not having nuclear families as something inherent to black people because of what slavery did, well, there were people who were making that argument back in the 60s and 70s. It's been completely deep-sixed since. Anybody who went back to 1955 in black America and expected to find the same 70% rate of children being raised by one parent would be surprised. Black people were pretty square that way until really about 1962 and 3.
And what do you think about the thesis then, mostly a conservative argument, that the state wedded black women and gave them money for having kids and therefore they didn't marry and so on? It's pretty oversimplified in terms of a social science equation. Mm-hmm. But the general idea, the Great Society, Johnson's Great Society, and affirmative action and welfare programs and so on actually hurt the black community rather than help.
Yeah, and unfortunately it's true, and you have to talk about it carefully because it's not about there being any epidemic of welfare queens. That was never any type of person. Right. And it's not that there shouldn't be welfare, and it's not that there weren't more white people than black people on welfare because of just simple demographics, just like today, people killed by the cops. But what gets lost, and this is a history that needs to be done. He would never do it, but David Simon should do a miniseries depicting this, which is that in 1966, there was a movement. It started in New York and it spread across the country. White Marxists thought that if they got as many poor black women on the rolls as possible, then it would bankrupt the government and we would have to start all over again. That actually happened. The people in question included Frances Fox Piven, who is still alive. And I'm not trying to, call her this horrible racist Marxist. She thought that this was a good idea. She's unrepentant today. And I understand where she and Richard Cloward, who was then her husband, where they were coming from. They were Marxists. Okay. They thought that the American experiment had failed. That is a permissible view. And they thought that black people deserved this welfare because automation was coming and because black people had suffered for so long. So what that meant was that in between 1966 and 1972 came the American urban situation where being on welfare in many neighborhoods was a default. And unless you're really elderly now, you don't remember a black America that was different. And so it's easy to think that that's what it was like in 1915 and you think in the Depression, it must have been that way. But that business of welfare as a norm, even if most women were still working on the side, it's not that people are lazy, but the idea that there's a neighborhood where every second household has something to do with taking checks from the government, that did not exist until 1966, when the idea was make welfare easier to get, stop bothering people about having to get a job, as opposed to, and you have to be an old movie fan to know this, but the snippy white social worker who knocks on the door and makes sure you don't have a man there, and they're always trying to cut off the payments. One movie where that's shown in full color is Claudine with Diane Carroll. She's dealing with a white social worker, but those are antique movies now. And so you have to be of a certain age to have seen them or to know about them. So yeah, welfare's expansion was a reparation in the late 60s. It was all very charismatic. It would make for a good movie, but it had the unintended effect of teaching generations of Black people that it's a norm. Let me put that a different way. It made welfare a norm. And if you grow up in a neighborhood like that, seeing welfare as a norm isn't good for you, because frankly, the norm should be that everybody works full time and the occasional unfortunate person is on welfare for a while. And so it really was part of transforming Black America in ways that really were not for the good. Nobody knew that's what was going to happen. And that's because social history is complicated. So a lot of people just want white people hate Black people, and that's where we are. No, the welfare revolution of 1966 is a lot of why Black America is where it is even now. Talk about legacies. And that was the creation of white people who were on Black people's side. But this story is not told.